Alright, hello and welcome to our last lecture of the course. So this is Real World Interventions on Friday, April 21st. So this whole time in this course, Social Psychology, we've been talking about what is social psychology, what kind of theories are there about social psychology, about phenomena in the real world. We've talked about lots of research findings in social psych. And we talked a bit throughout the course with each topic about how you might see this in your own life, in current events, in the world around you. So we're going to wrap up the whole course by talking about how people have applied social psychology findings to address important social problems. That's one of the goals of any science, and social psychology is certainly not immune to that rule, is that it should be useful in the real world. So we'll talk a little bit about a couple of interventions that have been developed from social psychology to address real problems. So we're going to start by talking about what are the WISE interventions, what does this term mean, and then we'll go through 5 different interventions that are really helping people, and we'll see what that looks like, how they're used, and you'll recognize some of the concepts from things we've already talked about in the course. So start with, what do we mean when we're talking about interventions in social psychology? Well, it's not this kind of intervention. We're not talking about the kind of intervention that you do when you think someone needs to go to rehab or something like that, although you could absolutely use social psychology concepts to help with that kind too. We're talking about interventions in social psych. We're talking about something a little bit different. We're talking about this idea of WISE interventions, which you can think of as being ordinary, brief, and precise. So ordinary, meaning we're not doing anything totally weird with these interventions. We're creating interventions that can be very easily sort of added into people's lives or into the government policies, things like that. So very ordinary things that we can do. They tend to be brief, so they tend to be, and precise as well. So they tend to be, not super time involved. And you'll see some of these are really simple changes, so minor, that can have these really big effects. And precise means that they're not just these blanket interventions designed to solve every problem possible. Instead, they're very targeted, specific interventions aimed at solving very specific issues. So WISE interventions, what do they do? The goal is to identify an aspect of people's psychology that harms their outcomes in some way and aim to change this process. So first you have to identify the psychological processes at play that are leading to some kind of negative outcome. And then you have to try to change them, to change the way people think, how they behave, how they feel, in a way that's going to help them flourish and have better outcomes in some way. So what you do with the WISE intervention is you start with a theory, so you know how to address the problem. So you identify a theory. It could be something like social identity theory or the elaboration likelihood model. You identify something that we know from social psychology, and you use that to develop a brief and precise exercise. So what you're doing is you're taking a theory, you're turning it into some kind of practice, some kind of exercise that people can do. Again, you'll see several examples of this in a couple minutes here, in some way that's going to help them improve, have better outcomes of some kind, some way that's going to help them. So now we'll talk about some interventions that are really helping people. And this is just really a selection of ones that I think you guys will find interesting. If you are interested in this even more, you can go find lots more. And I'll include a couple links at the end here. But the first one we're going to talk about is improving voting. So this research team of Bryan and colleagues, 2011, not that long ago that they started this intervention, they identified the problem of voter turnout being low. So if you look at how many people there are in the U.S. and you compare that to things like how many people vote in elections, you'll see a huge discrepancy. Even the 2016 presidential election, if you compare the population of the U.S. to the number of people that voted, is a massive discrepancy. And that's the presidential election. Super high press, really in people's minds. We've all been bombarded with that information. So you'd think you'd get a lot of people to vote there. If you go to these more local elections or things like that, the turnout is often even worse. And this is a problem, right, because people who intend to vote and who, have important things that they want to vote about don't always do so. And that means that we're losing a lot of the value of living in a democracy like this, because there are so many people who should be voting and maybe even who want to vote, but who just aren't doing it. So how do we fix this issue? Of course, there's no, I'm not going to show you a solution that magically solves everything, but we can talk about whether this issue can be fixed, at least in some part, whether we can address this in some way by invoking voting, as you'll see, as part of one's self-concept. If you think back to the self-concept is your kind of beliefs and thoughts about yourself. Who do you think you are? So this intervention that I'll show you here is trying to make voting a part of your self-concept, which should make you more likely to act in line with it and actually go out and vote. So in the study that they did here, they had people complete an election survey. So they're asking them about their voting behavior, their preferences, whether they wanted to vote or not, things like that. And their key manipulation here was different phrasing of questions. So they were asking the same question, but they did it in a slightly different way. So you can link this back. We just talked in social psych and the law about that Elizabeth Loftus study with the car crash. How fast were the cars going when they contacted, when they hit, when they smashed? That's an example of, leading questions, bias in your memory. You can think about this study here as just phrasing the question differently in a very similar way to produce very different outcomes. So in one condition, they had the question look like this. It was, how important is it to you to be a voter in the upcoming election? Versus how important is it to you to vote in the upcoming election? So you can see here that in the second option here, how important is it to you to vote? That's just a verb, an action. How important is it to you to go do this thing? Versus in the first option here, how important is it to you to be a voter? That's invoking the self-concept. How important is it to you as a person that your self-concept includes the fact that you are a voter? And this is a really tiny difference, right? It's just this difference in phrasing that's going to invoke either this kind of situational aspect of to vote, not that personal, versus invoking a dispositional attribution, I'm a voter, making that part of your self-concept. And they looked then at their actual voting behavior. So this differentiates this study from a lot of the ones that we talk about in class, which are all lab studies designed to examine whether some phenomenon exists and what kind of boundary conditions there might be. That's the purpose of lab studies. This study is an intervention because you're giving people this question, you're giving this very subtle manipulation in this election survey, and then you look at their real actual voting behavior. Does this really tiny little manipulation impact what they actually go out and do? So they did this in two studies. They did it in California in the 2008 presidential election, and they did it in New Jersey as well in the 2009 gubernatorial election. So they have results from two different elections where they use the same manipulation in the surveys. And this slide here is going to show you the results in these two. So this graph on the left here, experiment 2, there's one more experiment, I think, which was the lab experiment. Experiment 2, California sample, 2008 U.S. presidential election. B on the right side, experiment 3, 2009 New Jersey gubernatorial election. You can see on the x-axis here, they have the verb condition, the white bar, the noun condition, and the black bar. So the verb condition is, how important is it to you to vote? Versus the noun condition, the black bar is, how important is it to you to be a voter? And on the y-axis is percentage voter turnout. So the people they gave this survey to, how many of them actually went out and voted? So you can see, it's really easy to see the difference here between the white and the black bars. The noun condition led to higher voter turnout. That's pretty impressive. So you'll note here that even the verb condition to vote is over 80% voter turnout in the part A and just under it in part B. So this is a pretty motivated sample already. But invoking that noun condition, making it part of your self-concept, it jumps all the way up to 95% in the 2008 presidential election, not 90% in the gubernatorial election. So you see that noun condition leads to higher voter turnout. Oh yes, I'm a voter. Greater internalization of voting as part of who you are. So for something as simple as this phrasing of, it's important to vote versus it's important to be a voter, you can think about this as applying to those kinds of stickers that you see after elections that usually says, like, I voted. Of course, that's an action, right? Maybe what you should be doing instead is making it a self-concept, making it a dispositional, and saying, I'm a voter. That might have some more impact. So this is one study that shows that this really ordinary, brief, and precise intervention of making it part of your self-concept can have really big impacts. All right, we can talk next about some research about addressing the race achievement gap. So this is going to follow really well from stereotyping and prejudice. And you heard Taylor talk a little bit about this on Friday with Stereotype Thread. He originally was going to talk about this in his slides there, but we're talking about it here instead. So Watson and Cohen in 2011, again, another recent intervention, they were looking at this data, this hard evidence of a racial achievement gap in even as young as, preschool, elementary school, kindergarten, things like that, all the way up even through college, that shows an achievement gap in that white students tend to perform better than racial minorities such as black students, Hispanic students, etc. Well, Watson and Cohen were like, okay, so we already know a lot of the reasons why that might happen. We talked about things like stereotype threat, of course, even without a real difference in ability, this difference in kind of situational cues or salience of stereotypes. And they were like, okay, we already know all that, but they wondered if it's also the case that racial minorities might be less certain about whether they belong in an institution like academia. And that can come as early as, in elementary school, just things like stereotypes and the culture in America right now. And it can persist all the way through things like college. So they were like, okay, so maybe this perceived lack of belonging is having a big impact. Because indeed, there is quite a bit of research that shows that feeling like you don't belong in some domain, some area of your life, can really undermine your performance in that area. So research has shown that lack of belonging can undermine academic performance. Taylor also talked a little bit about women in STEM when he was here, about stereotype threat, feeling like you don't belong there because everybody there is a white man and you're a woman in STEM. That can also lead you to disidentify, disengage. Right, so this might be happening across the board, and that begs the question then of whether we can at least partially address the racial achievement gap by increasing feelings of belongings. And of course we've talked a lot about belonging in group processes, the need to belong, this kind of innate drive to seek social bonds. When we feel like we don't belong, that can lead to really negative outcomes. We talked about negative effects of lacking close relationships when we were talking about close relationships earlier. So if we can increase feelings of belongingness in people who identify as racial minorities, maybe we can help reduce this racial achievement gap. So in 2011, they did this study. It was quite a long-term longitudinal study, actually, where they had students read a message that framed social adversity in school as shared and short-lived versus a control condition where they didn't get that same information. So the first thing they had students do was, and they had both European American and African American students in this study, so they can kind of compare them against each other. So they had students read a message about how everybody faces adversity in school, everybody does that, it's shared, and it's also short-lived, so it doesn't persist the whole time you're in college. It tends to be a much shorter-lived issue that everybody goes through. Then they encouraged their students who are in the study here to attribute adversity to common transient aspects of college adjustment. So in other words, this is something that everybody deals with. It's just a part of being in college. So rather than attributing those experiences of adversity to fixed deficits that are unique to the participant or to their ethnic group, so for example, rather than thinking that their experience of adversity is linked to the fact that they're black for African American participants, or just them, they just can't cut it in college. Instead, encouraging them to attribute that as being a common thing that's really short-lived, as we talked about, that's just a part of being in college. You have to get through that, and then it'll get better. Students then received information from older students saying the adjustment process was hard, but it got better with time. So really reinforcing this is hard, everybody deals with this, but it's really short-lived. So in particular, the messages that they read said that this was consistent across gender and ethnic groups. So both men and women experience this. White people experience this as well as ethnic minorities. So you can see, even just from these things that we're talking about on this slide, this is pulling from several social psych concepts. So, for example, the second line here, attributing adversity to common transient aspects of college adjustment. This would be like encouraging people to make a situational attribution, not a dispositional attribution. Something about the situation, particular college, is leading to this adversity, not something about you as a person that means that you don't belong there. And of course, this issue in the third bullet point here of social consensus, you're actually hearing from older students. You're not just hearing from the experimenter telling you this thing. You're actually hearing from other people, which makes it a lot more meaningful, getting this social consensus. So this is an example quote that students might read. It says, freshman year, even though I met large numbers of people, I didn't have a small group of close friends. I was pretty homesick, and I had to remind myself that making close friends takes time. Since then, I've met people, some of whom are just as close as my friends in high school were. It's really emphasizing these aspects of this intervention. So after this, all students were then asked to write their own essay describing how their own experiences in college echoed the experiences summarized in the survey. So after they read all those passages and testimonials from other students, they were told, all right, now it's your turn, and whatever you write, we're going to use to show to future students. So kind of creating this chain of essays. And this is touching on a couple things as well. So even the fact of being part of this chain of people writing about their experiences, it's going to really hammer home their belonging manipulation intervention of, yeah, you do belong. You already read all these other people's responses. Now you're going to write your own and help somebody else. You belong to this group. As well as, we didn't talk about it in this class, but there's definitely some research showing that if you write things down, it can make it seem more real. So rather than just having them think on their own as they're reading these testimonials about whether it's true for them, here you're asking them, write about it for yourself. Really make it true for you as well. Kind of reappraise your own experiences in light of this. They also completed a few other tasks that were designed to help them internalize the message. So most prominently, they did a daily diary for the next 7 days after this in-lab session, reporting their experiences of adversity and their sense of belonging. So encouraging them to track what kind of experiences of adversity they're going through, what they're struggling with, and tracking their sense of belonging over time. This is a graph of the results. It's a little bit complicated. You can see the description on the left side here, figure number 1, raw GPA. So this is just tracking your GPA. You can see on the x-axis, it starts with fall term of the student's first year and goes into sophomore, junior, and senior year. So you see they're really tracking this student's GPAs all throughout college for the most part, fall term, spring term. You can see, of course, there's 4 different lines here. The kind of gray diamond-shaped markers with the dotted line, that would be European Americans in the control group, so not getting the belonging treatment, versus the black square bars with the dotted line, that would be European Americans in the social belonging treatment. Then you have the light gray triangles, that's African American students in the control group, and then the black X's with the non-dotted line, that would be African American students in the social belonging treatment. So lots of different lines. First thing I want you to look at here is the lines for European Americans in the control and belonging groups. That's the light gray diamond versus the black square. And you can see there's certainly some fluctuation over time, but they're not too different from each other. But if you look at them versus the African American students in the control group, those light gray triangles, that's a big difference in GPA that between these two groups of students. And of course, there's fluctuation here as well. In particular, these students seem to have a kind of big dip in their junior year, sophomore, junior year, goes back up in senior year. But you can see there's a big difference here. But if you compare that to the black X's, the African American social belonging treatment, they start out pretty low, even a little bit lower, although I'm not sure if that's significant, even a little bit lower than the African American students in the control group. You can see the line after fall term of the freshman year, that's where the social belonging treatment begins. And you can see the steady improvement in this line with the black X's, where these students are getting better and better over time. Their GPA is improving and improving, and by the time we get to their senior year, they're exactly the same as the European American students in the control group. So that's a really big effect. The belonging group jumps up to the same level as white students. That's a really big effect. And again, this is a pretty simple exercise. It's that one long lab session where they're reading these testimonials, writing their own, getting these messages, followed up by that 7 days of the daily diary where they're tracking their own adversity and belonging. And even after that, in each semester that they are assessed again, you see these huge differences. So invoking the sense of belonging is really, really helpful. We looked at a couple other variables as well, and so you'll be able to see it here, A, B, and C. So graph A that I'm going to show you, this is self-reported belonging uncertainty. So this would be like, I don't know whether I belong in college, I'm not sure I fit in here. And you'll see in a minute, the gray bar is going to be the control group, the black bar is going to be the belonging treatment. On the x-axis, you'll have European versus African American students. Graph B is going to be accessibility of negative racial stereotypes. So how easy is it for people to think about negative racial stereotypes? And then graph C is going to be accessibility of self-doubt. So how accessible are these ideas of doubting yourself? Could be doubting your belonging, could be doubting your performance, things like that. How accessible is self-doubt to you? So the first one here, self-reported belonging uncertainty. If you look just at European American students, the gray bar randomized control group, the black bar social belonging treatment, they're the same, nothing really different there. If you look at the gray bar for African American students, the control group who did not get the belonging treatment, that's a lot higher. That's quite a bit higher, actually, and that's belonging uncertainty. So these students feel a lot more uncertainty about whether they belong in college. But if you compare that to the black bar, which is the social belonging treatment, that's a big difference. If you just looked at the social belonging treatment for African American students, it's exactly the same as either condition for European American students. So this intervention is really tamping down their belonging uncertainty into these kind of more regular levels that any given college student, or rather I should say that white college students are experiencing. And it's getting rid of some of that extra belonging uncertainty, which is probably tied to perceptions about your race, about whether that means you don't belong. Jump over to accessibility of negative racial stereotypes. You can see for European American students, there's a bit of a difference where the control group has a bit more accessibility of those stereotypes. But the important one to look at is for African American students. And again, you see the similar pattern as graph A. In the control group, when they didn't get that belonging intervention, negative racial stereotypes are a lot more accessible than when they did. And when they did get that treatment, they're not too different from European American students. Last but not least, if you look at accessibility of self-doubt, for the European American students, there's a bit of a difference here, but not too big, where the belonging treatment actually makes self-doubt a little more accessible. I'm not sure they anticipated that. But the big difference to look at here is the African American students, where in the control group, self-doubt is way more accessible than when they've gotten that belonging treatment. So that belonging treatment makes self-doubt less significant, less kind of hovering over them, and less of an issue than it would be if they had not gotten that intervention. And all of these results, the GPA results, belonging uncertainty, racial stereotypes, self-doubt, accessibility, this is all from a pretty simple intervention based on social psych research about the importance of feeling like you belong. All right, we're going to keep going on this school track and talk about helping struggling students. This study is not about college students, it's about younger students, but it certainly applies to college too. So with this study done by Carol Dweck and colleagues in 2007, this was about your beliefs about intelligence. So lots of research, lots of lab studies and whatnot have shown, and correlational studies, have shown that people who believe that intelligence is malleable rather than fixed tend to perform better. So Taylor touched on this a little bit too when he was here in Stereotype Thread. You can have these different kinds of beliefs. You might think that intelligence is just something you're born with, it's unchangeable, it's fixed, you are how smart you are, and nothing else you can do about it. You can have this different kind of belief that says that intelligence is malleable, it's changeable, it's incremental. So you can do things to grow in intelligence. You can have a learning goal, you can have a mastery goal rather than performance, right? You can do things that are going to help you become more intelligent, broaden your horizons and whatnot. And research shows that people who have this belief that intelligence is malleable, it's not just fixed, tend to perform better. And it's because they tend to be motivated by learning more so rather than just grades. They tend to be motivated by wanting to learn, wanting to put more in their brains, wanting to get better at things that they're doing. That's what's motivating them, rather than people who believe that intelligence is fixed, are really focused more on demonstrating their intelligence by getting good grades, having good performance in school, things like that. And having that belief that intelligence is malleable, being more motivated by learning, that tends to lead you to persist more in the face of adversity. So when you're struggling in school, if you believe intelligence is fixed and you're struggling, you're just like, well, I just suck at school, nothing I can do about that. Versus if you have this belief that you can change your intelligence, you can get better over time, and you're struggling, you're more likely to view that as, temporary. You can work harder, push through it, and not struggle anymore. So Dweck and colleagues, with this line of research I'm going to show you about here, they were like, okay, so we know that this happens, and there's this clear connection to school, so can we really use this kind of out in the field to help students who are actively struggling? So what they did in this study was they had 8th grade students, that was their participants. These 8th grade students, they participated in an 8-week workshop on the brain, study skills, and psychology. So for the most part in this 8-week workshop, these students were all learning the same different things about how the brain works, how to study better, what psychology tells us about, things like, note-taking, stuff like that. So they learned all the same kinds of things, except for one difference, and that was that in the experimental condition, the students also learned that intelligence is malleable and can be developed like a muscle getting stronger. So in this condition, they're really banking on that incremental intelligence theory. They're trying to get people to develop this idea, this belief about intelligence, that it's malleable, that it's changeable, you can do better over time, you can develop it, you can kind of work it out, you can get it to be better. Using this sort of allegory, metaphor of a muscle getting stronger. The more you work out your muscles, the stronger they get, same way that your brain works with intelligence. So again, in the 8-week workshop, all the students learned most of the same things. The only difference is that in one condition, they learned this key concept of intelligence as malleable. If you look then about how they are doing over time and this is in particular in their math class, you can see that this intervention has an effect. So there are 3 time points represented in this graph. Time 1, which is well before the intervention. Time 2, which is right before the intervention, looking at their math grades. And time 3, which is post-intervention, seeing whether learning about intelligence as being malleable rather than fixed, seeing whether that helps them do better in this math class in particular. So you can see in the control condition, who did not learn about this intelligence as malleable idea, their grades are steadily declining, which is that's a bummer. But you can see in the experimental condition where they did learn this, that from time 2 to time 3, they actually are getting a little bit better, and moreover, they're not experiencing that continued decline that the control group is. So this is not a huge, enormous change per se, but it's definitely a change from this little simple intervention about how you view intelligence. So these are a couple of example comments from the teachers of students in the experimental condition taken from the paper, so abbreviated to protect people's anonymity. So this first one is L, who never puts in any extra effort and doesn't turn in homework on time, actually stayed up late working for hours to finish an assignment early so I could review it and give him a chance to revise it. He earned a B+ on the assignment. He had been getting C's and lower. So this is example comments from teachers of students who learned about intelligence being malleable. This first one shows that you can create this kind of change in behavior, improve people's motivation to do well if you give them the belief that they can improve. Second one here, M was performing far below grade level. During the past several weeks, she has voluntarily asked for extra help from me during her lunch period in order to improve her test-taking performance. Her grades drastically improved from failing to an 84 on her recent exam. That's really impressive, right? Again, it's this very simple, this brief, precise intervention, but it can have these really impressive effects. And this, by the way, is directly relevant to all of you as well. If you are realizing as we're talking about this that you do have this belief that intelligence is fixed, that might be having some negative consequences for you. So it might be worthwhile to try to think more about intelligence as being malleable. Because even just having this belief that it is malleable can help you to do better. It can kind of open the door to improving, to not being scared of things like exams and finals and whatnot because they're things that you might do poorly on, but rather looking at school as a whole as an opportunity to grow and to learn. All right, now we're going to shift gears a little bit into relationship interventions. So first we'll talk about helping people with low self-esteem to have better relationships. So there's a lot of work that's been done, especially in the last couple decades or so, about low self-esteem in relationships. So of course we learned about self-esteem way back in the self. It's just your evaluation of yourself. Do you like yourself or not? And research has shown that people with low self-esteem tend to have a hard time in relationships, and that's probably not too surprising. But people with low self-esteem typically don't believe that they're good. They don't believe that they're worthwhile people. So they don't believe that their partners really like them. They have a hard time thinking that their partners really care about them and really think that they're good people. So you can probably see how this happens. You don't really think your own self is worthwhile, and you have a hard time then believing that your partner does think that. So the question then is, well, can we help people to kind of fix this a little bit? Can we help people change how they think about their relationships so that they can have better relationships over time and not just be plagued with these insecurities, this low self-esteem, and doom relationships that they get into? Of course, not that that happens all the time if you have low self-esteem, but it can be an issue, so it's very worthwhile to look into how we might help people. So in the study we're going to talk about here, they had 3 conditions that had writing tasks. They brought couples into the lab, they assessed their self-esteem, they had them do these different kinds of activities. So in one condition, the abstraction condition, they asked people to explain why their partner admired them. So to explain why your partner admired you, describe what it meant to you and its significance for your relationship. So the important thing here is why. So why does your partner admire you? They're really forcing them to think of ideas of reasons why their partner might really care about them and like them and think they're worthwhile. In the questions condition, it was similar to the abstraction, but the difference is that they're explaining whether they think what their partner has said about them indicates that they admire them. So the difference here is that they're not explaining why, they're just explaining whether it does. So does this mean that your partner admires you or not? Consider whether it was meaningful to you and significant for your relationship. The control condition then was that they had no writing tasks. So the control condition is like, just go about your business in your regular relationship, no intervention, and see what happens. So any intervention, of course, really needs a control condition of some kind, so you can compare whether your intervention is having any effect at all, and if so, how big is that effect. So here's a graph. I'm going to show you 2 more on the next slide as well, but this graph is looking at felt security. So it's how secure do you feel in your relationship? So there are 3 lines here representing those 3 conditions. The kind of small dotted line here is the questions condition, so whether it was meaningful or whether your partner said they admired you. The kind of larger dotted lines are the control conditions, so no writing task at all, didn't do anything. And the solid line is the abstraction condition, which is why does your partner admire you? On the x-axis, we have self-esteem going from low to high. So for now, I want you to just kind of ignore the right side of the graph with the high self-esteem. Just look at the left side, that's the low self-esteem. That's the side that we're really concerned with this intervention. So you can look at the control condition. This line is the lowest. So these low self-esteem people in relationships feel the least secure in their relationship if they've done no writing tasks. This is like normal everyday security in their relationship. If you look at the question condition, so does what your partner said, does it mean they admired you or not? You can see there is a jump here. So even just thinking about whether your partner admires you or not can lead to this jump in security so you feel more secure. But the biggest difference is from either of these conditions on the bottom here to the abstraction condition all the way at the top here. So thinking about why your partner admires you, that can lead to this really big jump in felt security. That's over a point difference on a scale, which is quite a big effect. So remember these kinds of scales, we might also often have things like ceiling effects where everybody's kind of responding at the top of the scale. But if you use this kind of an intervention, people with low self-esteem, they're going to report feeling more secure in their relationship. So that's a good thing, right? We've helped people to feel more secure. We can also extend this to 2 other DVs that were measured. We have relationship quality, we have negative behaviors. So this time, this graph looks a little bit different. The dotted line is the control conditions, whereas the solid line is the abstraction condition. So you can hear that when you're looking just at relationship quality, and again, you don't need to pay too much attention to the high self-esteem on the right side, but the low self-esteem, this LSE abbreviation on the left side, shows that from control to abstraction condition, you actually do have a jump in relationship quality. So people are reporting better relationship quality if they have low self-esteem in their relationship after doing that kind of an exercise. And then if you look at the bottom graph B here, negative behavior, same kind of setup. Solid line is the intervention condition, the dotted line is the control condition, low to high self-esteem. If you look at the left side of the graph here, low self-esteem, you actually have much lower negative behavior, which is a good thing, so less negative behavior if you've done that intervention versus if you had not. All right, so that's how we can help. One of the ways that we can help people with low self-esteem to do better in relationships, or to feel better rather in relationships. You can also use this kind of research to improve marital conflicts. So if you remember back to close relationship, we talk about at the end of that lecture about 3 tips for improving marriages. So of course those are all still relevant. You could consider those to be interventions as well. But this one's doing something a little bit different. So this study was done in 2013. This is centered around the idea that one of the big things that predicts declining marital satisfaction is this idea of negative affect reciprocity, which is basically just a chain of retaliatory negativity. So one person does something kind of, bad in a relationship, doesn't do the dishes, doesn't take out the trash, things like that, is kind of insensitive maybe. The other person experiences this negative affect. They're like, oh, this sucks, like you're such a jerk. And the other person then might respond in turn with a negative affect and negative behavior, and which of course provokes it again from the other person, so creating this really downward cycle of negativity. But this thing from psychologists inside of emotion reappraisal is one thing that can help people to manage their negative emotions. And what you do with emotion reappraisal is you reinterpret the meaning of emotion eliciting situations. So something bad happens in your relationship, you might be likely to jump to conclusions that, oh, it's just another sign that my marriage is falling apart, or oh, it's just another sign that my partner is a huge jerk. But that's because you're really invested in that situation. You've been experiencing this negative affect chain. If you take a step back and look at it from another perspective, you're reappraising what's really happening, you might be less likely to jump to that conclusion and more likely to see it in at least a somewhat more objective way of what's really happening versus this kind of affect-laden interpretation based on your past affect, your past negativity in the relationship. But the issue, of course, is that people don't often do that on their own. People tend to see things from their own perspective as a default, so they're really looking at it from their own kind of emotion-mired perspective. The question then is, can we use this knowledge to improve marital quality and prevent declines? So can we use emotion reappraisal as kind of a technique, an intervention tactic, to help people kind of break that chain of retaliatory negativity? And of course, this kind of intervention is not meant for people who are, for example, in abusive relationships. That emotion reappraisal really would not be that helpful necessarily for that kind of situation. But instead, it's kind of your everyday relationship that maybe you're just experiencing some declines in quality over time that is as a result of this negative affect reciprocity. Maybe the solution is to take a step back and look at it from another angle and see if maybe you can kind of avoid that continuing that spiral. So in this study, what they did is they took 120 married couples from the Chicago area. They reported their overall marital satisfaction every 4 months for 24 months. So a quick note here, whenever you're doing couples research dyad data, it might often be the case that people are going to look solely at heterosexual couples. That's because there's always the possibility that heterosexual and homosexual couples have something different about the two of them, but it's often very hard to recruit a sufficient sample size of homosexual couples in order to actually compare the two groups. So people will often kind of take the easy way out and just limit it to heterosexual couples so they don't have to worry about potential differences there. That was a side note there. But so this study, they recruited 120 couples and they had them report their overall satisfaction every 4 months for a period of 2 years. For the first year, for the first 12 months, they had the couples do identical things. So there's no condition differences in the first 12 months. And one of the big things that they did was writing about significant marital conflict. So they had them write about a conflict, what happened, what their thoughts are, how they felt. So they're kind of establishing that as a procedure in this study. But in the experimental condition, at the 12-month mark, they introduced something new. In particular, they had the experimental condition, couples in that condition, they had them write about how a third party who wanted the best for everyone involved would see the conflict. So they had themselves kind of get out of their own shoes, put themselves in the shoes of somebody else who just wants the best for everyone, who's not one of the two members of the married couple. And they wanted to have them write from that perspective about how that person would see the conflict. So you can probably see how that's going to work here, where the examples we talked about on that previous slide about your partner does something negative and you kind of, interpret it as, oh, it's just one more reason why they're such a jerk. Whereas if you're writing about this conflict from a third party, you're probably more likely to kind of step out of your own shoes and be like, okay, what did they really do? What would somebody else, some impartial observer, say about this? And they also reminded participants of this kind of reappraisal goal at months 14, 18, and 22. So at month 12, the 1 year mark was when they introduced this experimental condition, where they're writing about the conflicts, they're writing about it from a third party perspective. And they reminded participants of that kind of reappraisal goal at 2 months increments for the remainder of the study. So here you can see the results of this study, and the bottom here you can see a lot of information about the figure itself. On the y-axis is overall marital quality. And what they did here was I believe this is z-scores, I could be wrong though, but what they're doing here is they're kind of standardizing the measures so that 0 is kind of like average marital quality. So above 0, 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, this is above average marital quality. Below 0, negative 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, that's below average marital quality. On the y-axis, we have months since the study entry. So 0, 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, 24, and the 24-month mark is when they terminated the study. The solid black line is going to be the control condition, who are just writing about marital conflicts without that third-party observer perspective, versus the blue dotted bar is going to be the reappraisal condition, which is the experimental condition where they're writing about it from that perspective. You can see if you look just at the solid black bar, the control condition, you see this kind of steady decline over the 2-year period where they're starting out a little bit above average in marital quality and then it's declining to a little bit below average. And again, that's just kind of normal effects of marital quality over time. If you look, though, at the blue bar, and you can see where the reappraisal intervention begins, at first they're pretty much exactly the same as the control condition, but at month 12, once that reappraisal intervention begins, this is actually really impressive. You see this decline just dramatically reduce. So it's not necessarily the case that this intervention is actively increasing their marital quality to above average, but it's kind of preventing that normal decline from taking place, or at least it's dropping it off to a much slower rate. So that's pretty impressive, just from having them learn about how to do this reappraisal and reminding them about it every 2 months. That's enough to halt that decline in its tracks. Alright, so that's the 5 different interventions we're going to talk about today. Before we wrap up, here's our review activity for today. So the next slide is going to be your video lecture response. So for this, I'd like you to do is a little bit more comprehensive than usual. I'd like you to take a few minutes to look back through your notes from the class. So look back through topics that you thought were particularly interesting. You go back at things like the self, persuasion, group processes, etc. So look back through your notes from this class. Identify one concept that you think could be used in an intervention to solve some kind of social problem. So one thing you thought was particularly interesting, you think could be really applicable to solving a problem. And then write 1 paragraph each about what the concept is and why you think it's useful to know about. So just from a blanket perspective, what is the concept, why is it important? For your second paragraph, write about what situations this concept is relevant in. So describe a couple different situations where this concept can come into play. And for the third paragraph there, write a little bit about how someone might go about designing an intervention using this concept. Now, a quick note here, I'm not expecting you to have a complete, fully formed grant application for an intervention. That's not what this is. This is just a quick little exercise to look back at things you thought were interesting and think about how you might apply that to solve some kind of social problem in the real world. So take a couple minutes and think about that. Write a couple paragraphs for this video lecture response. You can all be on the same Word document, these 3 paragraphs. And then turn it into the Carmen Dropbox. That's going to be due at 11:59 p.m. on Friday, April 21st. Alright, so we can kind of wrap up here with the plug that these are just 5 selections of interventions that I thought you guys would be interested in, but there's of course way more that you can look into and you can think about. So if you want to know more about how social psych can be used in interventions, here are a couple of links that you can check out if you'd like to. So the first link here is the Stanford Do Tank. It's kind of Spark, S-P-A-R-Q, .stanford.edu. So this Do Tank, they call it the Do Tank, not a think tank. This is where this group of people partners with practitioners in the government, in businesses, in nonprofits Their goal is to create solutions to community problems. So it's exactly like what we've been talking about today with real-world interventions. Their goal is to highlight phenomena, research areas from social psych and from psychology more broadly, and think about how we can really use that to solve community problems, generate ideas for that. So really interesting stuff there. The second link here, Social and Behavioral Sciences Team 2015. This is a link that's going to take you to a kind of brief report from the Obama administration in 2015 about the first year of its team devoted to taking research insights and using them to better understand how people respond to and participate in federal programs. So things like retirement security, improving access to college, economic opportunities, access to healthcare coverage, things like that. So the link here is going to tell you a little bit more about the executive order, about using social and behavioral science research to better improve response to federal programs. The third link here, SBST 2016, this is a report from the National Science and Technology Council that's building on that link from 2015, the executive order and report, that includes a lot of extra information about each of these advancements, as well as additional improvements. And again, it's all based on behavioral science research. So you probably recognize a few things from social psychology here, as well as quite a few things we didn't have time to talk about in class, and even some insights from other areas of psychology and other areas of social science as well. So you can see, we talk about this as being important, and it's not limited to just learning about it in class and seeing it in your daily life, although I think that's a really awesome part about this class, being able to do that. But you can see how these kind of research insights can have really big effects in the real world as well. It can be utilized even by the White House in ways to help people improve their daily lives, to feel more secure in their retirement, have better access to college, have better access to healthcare and things like that. Alright, so to recap real-world interventions, social psychology can help make the world a better place. And we talked about theory-based precise interventions that can often have really impressive effects, and they're not that expensive to implement. So even those tiny little changes like changing the wording for voting from to vote to be a voter, even that tiny little wording change can help people to kind of incorporate that into their self-concept and be more likely to vote. We talked about low self-esteem and relationships. Just changing how you're viewing what your partner thinks about you can change how you feel in the relationship. These kinds of insights can apply to school interventions like racial achievement gap, as well as struggling students. All kinds of really interesting ways that these tiny little changes can have really impressive effects. All right, and with that, that wraps up our last day of new material for this class. I will see you guys on Monday. We're going to do a wrap-up activity, so I would say you might consider bringing your notes for the whole class to Monday's class, because we're going to spend our time in class that day reviewing kind of the whole class. And then after that, I'll see you again on Friday for the final exam. So as usual, if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, your video lecture response is due to the Carmen Dropbox by 11:59 p.m. on Friday. And then have a good weekend, and I'll see you on Monday.